Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rose and Ravini podcast. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunello Rosa. This week, we're talking about the dangerous connection via Russia between the wars in Ukraine and Israel. Brunello, we just heard that a few days ago it's emerged that some of the leaders of Hamas went to Moscow to speak to some officials at the Kremlin. Could you tell us more about this?
Certainly. The news emerged that some leaders of Hamas went to Moscow and had a meeting at the Kremlin, exactly in the same days when the deputy foreign minister of Iran was, in fact, in Moscow. So one wondered whether the two things are correlated. But the most important thing at this stage, even before start thinking about scenarios, which we will discuss later on, is the fact that Hamas thought that going to Moscow and meet the Kremlin was a good and wise idea, considering what's going on both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Clearly, these things couldn't go unnoticed.
Yeah. I mean, when we look towards the Middle East, there's a really complicated landscape of alliances and hostilities between various countries that's sort of shifting every year. What's the situation right now, and what are some of the recent developments that might help us understand this?
Yeah, so let's look at the two scenarios. Or people say war theaters at the moment. So Russia, Ukraine situation is that Russia has conquered around 70% of the Ukrainian territory. There was a counteroffensive. It was somewhat successful, but perhaps less than expected. Winter is coming. There will probably be another pause. The Ukrainians will probably use it to launch a new counteroffensive in spring 2024, but the Russians will use to entrench even more in what they've conquered so far. So there's actually no certainty the next counteroffensive could be better than the one this year. So the risk is that we are reaching a sort of stall in that situation. Regarding the Middle East, the key, I would say, scenario in which, or let's say, environment in which this everything that we see is happening is this long-term dispute between Saudi Arabia and Iran, let's say, for the leadership of the Muslim community at large. So Sunni Muslims are somehow represented by Saudi Arabia and the Shia Muslims by Iran. Now, these two countries have been effectively arch enemies for several decades, but recently they signed an agreement in Beijing. It's not very clear what's in that agreement, but the fact that they thought that they could sign an agreement is anyway a good thing in general terms. And only because that happened, the two countries could, in fact, join at the same time the BRICS country. We spoke about the BRICS enlargement some time ago. So um, um, this is, as I was saying, the environment in which everything is happening there. Then there's, of course, Israel. And Israel is a relatively new um, reality there. For that reason, it's not been recognized by several countries in the Middle East. Even at the UN level, there are 28 countries that still don't recognize Israel, and most of them are part of the Arab League, and so on and so forth. Um, Against this background, there have been several attempts to ease the tensions in the Middle East. First was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action designed by the Obama administration to make a deal with Iran. But that was then torn apart by Trump when he was elected. It was actually one of the first acts of the Trump administration pulling out of that accord. And the second is the Abraham Accords signed by Israel, Bahrain, Morocco, United Arab Emirates, and Sudan. Again, a rapprochement between Israel and some Muslim countries. And again, as we discussed in some column in the last couple of months, there have been attempts by Biden to try and make the deal of the century, so to speak, which is the mutual recognition between Israel and Saudi Arabia. That was going somewhere. Clearly, in that rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Israel, the missing bit was Iran. And that could have been the reasons why all these events have occurred in the last month or so.
Yeah. There's also a risk of this war spreading beyond its kind of current boundaries if other foreign actors get involved, and particularly people are worried about Hezbollah. Talk to me a bit more about sort of Hezbollah and where they might come in and how likely that sort of sense of escalation is.
Yeah, the problem is that behind Hezbollah there's Iran, as we said before. And actually behind Hamas, there's also Iran. So people fear that Iran is both behind two sides that are mostly fighting against Israel at the moment. Now, it is not so mechanic as some people think, because if Iran had actually planned and mastermind all these, most likely you would have seen a parallel attack from the north and the south, Hezbollah and Hamas at the same time, contemporaneously. In fact, this has not occurred. It's not just not occurred. Leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has actually made a speech on TV, and in that speech, while using, as you can imagine, kind of an incendiary language, at the same time, it wasn't hard, wasn't as hard as could have been, and in particular, he said that the responsibilities for the attack on Israel are fully of the Palestinians, like saying we from Lebanon have nothing to do with that. So kind of distinguishing Hezbollah from Hamas, suggesting that potentially Hezbollah doesn't want to get involved, and therefore Iran itself does not want to get involved.
Mhm.
So here the real question is, what's the relationship between Russia and Iran?
Yeah, yeah. There's also the sort of question of, Russia trying to put itself in the middle of this war in the Middle East, and playing some sort of a middle ground role, offering a sense of mediation. Is that plausible? Is that likely at all? And what would the consequence of that be?
That's what Russia might be trying to do. In the sense, Russia has offered to be a mediator, somehow surprisingly for a country that has perpetrated the atrocity that we have seen in Ukraine. Putin asked for, all contending parts to spare the civilians and be respectful of human lives. Again, seems a bit strange to hear from him. However, there's clearly an attempt from Russia to try to enter the Middle Eastern, I would say, chessboard, and play an important mediation role. Because if Russia managed to do so, for example, convincing people that Iran is not entering the conflict simply because Russia has asked Iran to do so, whether that's true or not, it doesn't really matter, it's the perception that matters, then Russia would have gained a massive geopolitical advantage that could use in the other open conflict, which is in Ukraine. At that point, it would say, look, if you ask my help to solve the Israeli-Palestinian situation, this means I'm a respectable country on the world scene. And so if I'm respectable enough, then it shouldn't bother me whatever I do in Ukraine. And fearing and seeing all these, and also considering that Russia has already made massive advancements in the Middle East, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the Sahel in particular. Again, as I said, having seen the situation, it is obvious that Europe is now trying to accelerate on Ukrainian accession to the bloc, because clearly it could be really the victim of the ultimate victim of all these much bigger games that are unfortunately ongoing on. And so the real question, and this is how I conclude my my column, is what part of Ukraine will eventually join the EU? Because if Russia managed to do what they want to do, will definitely keep part of the Ukrainian territory that it has conquered so far, at least for the time being. So perhaps not the entire Ukraine territory will enter the EU whenever this and if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having that conversation also sort of puts into context how extremely interconnected some of these, conflicts that might seem disparate actually are, and also sort of the return of, great power competition. It's something that, in the era of geopolitics, we hadn't really thought about for maybe a decade or so, when we thought, it might be sort of smaller actors or regional interests or private actors coming into play. Really, it is still about great powers, it seems. And that, is worthwhile watching for the weeks and months to come. So, as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your thoughts and insight.
Thank you. Until next time.